Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just gonna wait for a couple more minutes, just another minute to let um, everyone in. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar, which is a wider system approach with biodiversity net gain. Okay, if you've got any questions today during the webinar, if you can just pop them in the Q&A box, should be at the bottom of your screen. Then at the end of the presentation, we'll go through them and see if Henry can answer as many as you can. Lucky and privileged to welcome Henry today, who is not only an ecologist, he's also he's an ecology economist, and policy analyst. It's a bit of a tongue twister. But he's got a wealth of knowledge with about 30 years experience. His expertise is in agriculture, water and environmental policy and regulation, as well as landscape regeneration, governance and funding. So Henry, would you like to take it from here?
Thank you very much. Well, basically, actually, I'm not an ecologist per se, an ecological economist, which is a very different thing. I did once, a very long time ago, do a course in ecological systems as such, but I would not claim that at all. So, but I'm hoping to take an economist policy perspective on this. I have to first provide a disclaimer because I am employed part-time at DEFRA, but I will not, and I'm not allowed to impart any internal knowledge, privileged knowledge about DEFRA policy, etc. I'm not actually involved in BNG policy at all. So this is very much me with an external hat on as an ecological economist, working on governance, funding of landscape regeneration, so forth, giving a view, not a DEFRA view in any way. Okay, so we've got that across, so I don't get into any trouble. Now I'm just going to share my presentation. It's not a very long presentation, but I'll talk, hopefully it sort of will provide various things to talk about, and hopefully you'll have Q&A, etc. And we can then have a bit of a dialogue on it. It's a whizzy new system, which is even better if I could get it going, because it allows you actually, it's meant to allow you to do a presentation which sort of sits around you rather than sort of taking over the whole screen. But never mind. This still hopefully will work well, if I can get it going. Though it seems to be at the wrong end of the presentation, so I just have to take it to the right end. Okay. So the classic case with schemes like BNG, which are sort of nature markets, is that in order to be able to trade something, you've got to turn it into a commodity, a unit, some entity that can be traded. And obviously that's what's happened to BNG in terms of trying to create units and how they can be measured and so forth. And this obviously allows trading and is, has a rationale within economics as why you do that. But one of the things it can lose is the connectedness to the ecosystems that these units or locations, etc., exist. Because once you exchange, then you exchange with a different bit of biodiversity in a different place, and obviously with different linkages. And it's very difficult to do anything about that, because essentially you're by creating a market, you're removing its locational specificness. Now, of course, BNG try to do something about that in terms of the definition of biodiversity units by adding a few points or weighting value around strategic significance, so that if it fits in well to an ecosystem, to priorities, etc., it gets extra points. And that is helpful, obviously, but is still not the same as counting all the co-benefits and linkages of where it was originally, and getting wider benefits, or ensuring wider benefits from that transfer. Now, people often say, well, the answer is, in these circumstances, is to look at the co-benefits of this unit. This is particularly true also of carbon credits and trading carbon credits, which has the same problem, that you dislocate or take a bit of land from its place and move it to somewhere else. And so you have to think there's lots of valuable services that nature provides as well. And so maybe you could market a BNG unit as more valuable because of the added benefits in the new place that it's going to deliver. And there's a whole range of benefits that it can provide. The problem is, who will pay for that? Because obviously, particularly in the BNG situation, you've got to have a 10% uplift, but you are paying to counter damage one place with equivalent damage plus 10% else, sorry, equivalent benefits plus 10% elsewhere. So it's not really clear how you will get that extra. Now, so maybe you have a direct relationship with a developer, and they say, yes, actually, from a PR, corporate responsibility, etc., I'm willing to pay extra because I can see the wider benefits. But that is the developer in this case. Now, a lot of these benefits that are being delivered may have more value to other players, and they're not really in the transaction as such. So it could be the case that where this new bit of biodiversity is located, it has benefits in terms of reduced pollution into river systems, for instance, or reduced flood risk or whatever. Now, the people who might value that, like reduced pollution might be of value to a water company, and reduced flood risk might be of value to the Environment Agency in their flood risk maps, and not part of that transaction. So it's very difficult to see how you'll sort of pull in the value of those potential further benefits. The other alternative to look at least is local governance systems. Now, I hope you'll be aware a bit of what that sort of is about. If you've had any involvement in landscape recovery projects, for instance, there'll be discussions of governance. There's also the LENS landscape enterprise networks processes, where again they have ways of working sort of relationships between providers of ecosystem services and people who are beneficiaries, mainly from a supply chain resilience. And the Green Finance Institute have also talked about that in their toolkit. And there's a cooperative model that myself and a cooperative lawyer have been working on as well. So I'm just going to go through them. But what they effectively allow is the bringing in of other parties to the agreements, to the sort of deal, so that potentially the water companies, the Environment Agency, maybe people who are looking for carbon sequestration, other sort of elements of what you might be the benefits of landscape regeneration, can be brought into multi-party agreements in different sorts of ways. So let's just have a look at how that works. So I've just realized that some of the writing is black on a dark surface, which I hadn't noticed. But I had a few technical glitches this morning, I'm afraid, but hopefully you can read most of the idea that in a lens system, the idea is you have, it's the most simplistic, or simple governance system. So you basically have a load of landowners, farmers who are selling services, which in the landscape enterprise network scheme of things is basically supply chain resilience, which is quite a wide concept, obviously. So if a farm or landscape is more resilient, presumably it will slow down the water, less risk of flooding, less risk of drought, more biodiversity, so you're reducing the risks of disease, less need for pesticides and so on. And then a load of people who want those beneficiaries. Now they want that greater resilience, and they're likely to be in the supply chain. Nestle is obviously a key player there, who are looking around the world to make sure that their supply chains are as resilient as possible into the food system. And so what happens is the lens works with the buyers and sellers and gets a lead buyer and a lead seller for them to agree who should be the lead, and they enter into an agreement, but with subcontractors behind. So that's the basis of an agreement to what's to be done, what the project is, and what it should deliver, and how much is over what time span, and what the deliverers are going to be paid for doing that. So that's very simple using contracts. It has a certain amount of disadvantages, because if, as these things work out, you start with a particular project and then the project may change in scope or extend, or people say, well, let's do more of this or more of that. And of course, when that happens, all the contracts have got to be renegotiated and changed. So it can be quite bureaucratically heavy duty. And it's the contractual process itself can be a bit sort of competitive rather than collaborative, and obviously the buyers are trying to get the best deal and so on, as opposed to maybe trying to create a common purpose. And generally this is only done with the private sector around supply chain resilience. So the question is, can you extend that to other potential funders? And it's not clear, certainly that's not, as far as I understand it, being cracked as yet, though maybe if people know otherwise, do let me know. The next standard sort of model is, rather than just relying on contracts, you actually create some sort of organization. And the typical one is a community interest company. So it's non-profit. It can still have investors. And then all the buyers and sellers are sort of members of that company. And so that creates a level of collaboration, hopefully, and a level of agreement of the sort of contracts you're going to have. But then you still have to have a load of contracts. So the organization enters into a whole range of contracts, individual contracts with all the sellers, all the buyers, investors, or lenders. They're usually lenders. So there's a load of agreements. Again, all those agreements quite difficult to renegotiate if things change, if it works out that the plan of doing X to achieve certain benefits is not really working. And I mean, as with the other contracts, you have a lot of small print. And the reason you have the small print is that you have to foresee all the possible outcomes that might happen, and what the result that you might have, or what the response, and that has to be in the contract. So you can end up with, 30 contracts, all 30 pages long. You can imagine, just picture them in a pile, and also wonder, does anyone really read them? I mean, and understand them fully? And could it be the case that, for instance, the investors or lenders are able to pay for more expensive lawyers, etc., and spend more time so that the contract they have is, more in their interest, and protects them and offloads more risks to the other players? Maybe. So it's can lack transparency and be difficult to adapt and change over time. But I'd say that's the most dominant system in terms of being promoted, obviously, by the Green Finance Institute, and that's been put into place in the northwest in Cumbria, on the Wyre. A 9-year agreement, and that 9 years was required by the lenders, though as I understand, it's a break clause halfway, but still, that's, you don't get much of a chance to adapt and change, only one shot halfway. And the lenders wanted it so that they could effectively be repaid from their investment. So, which also indicates, who determines, who has the power, who shapes what happens. Everyone had to agree to that, basically, if it was going to happen. Then we look at the cooperative model. Now, the first thing is that actually it's slightly different. Rather than being all about agreeing a transaction or a particular project, the key thing to this sort of approach is you're trying to generate common purpose. So the idea is the cooperative actually will have a vision of, say, regenerating the whole landscape, which may be over 20, 30 years. Obviously, this is a huge task, but the idea is to build a sort of coalition of the willing who are on board with these broad objectives. And so essentially, the cooperative is more about, firstly, building relationships, building common purpose, building common direction, and so on. And so that then you can then find some projects which everyone agrees to, which may be typically, the quick wins or things that people feel will deliver most immediately. And because in setting up the cooperative, you actually agreed to how you're going to make decisions, how you're going to work together, how you're going to allow people in, entry and exit, how you're going to deal with disputes, etc. The board, who's on the board, operational decisions, all these sorts of things. A lot of the mechanisms are all in place, and so that's sort of, which requires time and investment. But then, when you actually agree on the project, it's relatively easy. You don't have to have all the small print you have in contracts, because actually, if you find things aren't quite turning out as you expected, you can call a meeting, people, and say, well, it's not quite working out, let's renegotiate exactly how this is going to work. And you can have standard rates for different things, so it's much easier to work out what to do. And hopefully also, because you've invested in the relationships and there's a common purpose, that means that it's easier to negotiate and adapt and change, and so on. That is the proposition, if you like. But all of these different models are really about trying to get a range of different beneficiaries to put money into a pot, to pay for various action on the ground. And of course, some of this is quite complicated. It requires research, it requires modeling, exactly what landscape interventions will ensure that you, for instance, get more water going down into aquifers to reduce the risk of drought. It's not a straightforward question. And actually, there may be tensions between groundwater flooding and reducing drought and so on. So it's not like just a straightforward deal over some BNG units. But having these relationships and building the evidence base and learning over time is a crucial element of the cooperative model. So I've just sort of introduced you to a whole new space, which hopefully isn't totally alien. And now you may be thinking, so how does BNG necessarily fit in? Now, the key thing about BNG is that it's a transaction around the biodiversity, measured biodiversity element, but we know there are potentially co-benefits. Now, I put this image of a puzzle because obviously trying to work out what deal can go where and whether there are co-benefits or where to place it. These are complex matters and particular to any transaction and so on. But the proposition is there will be some co-benefits which are not factored into the price and that's being paid for them. And so the proposition is, can you use some of those co-benefits in some way? And the two sort of possibilities that I see, and obviously it depends on the circumstances, etc., is firstly leverage for gaining partners, because if you're going to bring in these other partners, part of the thing you want them to invest in is a sort of evidence base for help with the evidence base for other benefits. And if you can say, well, we're first on this landscape, we've got various deals around BNG, we think there could be possibly co-benefits around flood risk management, drought reduction, etc., but we want to work with you, water companies, stroke, environment agency, insurance companies, etc., to see what they are and where they work. And also we can sort of maybe use your evidence to decide exactly where these BNGs, where we're going to create the biodiversity, etc., So you're trying to say you can get some freebies effectively if you work with us, but in return, we want you to come to the party and help us work out what the other benefits are and put you in a position maybe to then pay for other work which will deliver you further benefits. So I think because it's sort of already there, BNG on the ground, it provides the basis for trying to build partnerships and common purpose. The other thing, of course, is that once you've got partners on board and you're trying to work out a plan to regenerate a whole landscape, then part of the overall strategy could be identifying different bits of land which could be funded by BNG, but seeing those particular bits in a wider strategy. So you might also be having bits of land you think, well, we can get carbon sequestration on that. We can get some water company funded for that bit. We can get the Environment Agency funded for doing something else, and so on. So that you're bringing in all these different sources of funding in a broad strategy with all the farmers and beneficiaries on board. And you might even be able to then entice maybe some developers who feel that their wider interest in being seen as responsible, etc., matter into that partnership, because then they can tell the story about how their BNG payments are actually part of a broader strategy and of regenerating this whole landscape. So it's not just some sort of legal regulatory requirements, etc. It's actually them being part of something more significant, as you can do with maybe partners on carbon sequestration. It also means that you can try and choose who your partners are, because you do want to obviously create integrity and trustworthiness over this whole project, if you like, of landscape regeneration. And obviously people, I was just reading a report, I'm trying to remember who it was from, but about BNG and commitments made in planning documents not actually being carried on. I think carried out. These I think are on site items, but it may be the case that some developers want to separate themselves out as not being cowboys and taking this seriously and being a proper player and a responsible actor in this area. And so being part of these partnerships could be something they want to be. On the other hand, you might, if you're running this partnership, ensure you don't get into bed with someone who is trying to greenwash, who is actually undermining the system. So it's very much potentially a two-way street there. But this can be all part of actually trying to both shore up BNG as delivering legitimate outcomes, but also helping broader system benefits happen. So that is, I think I'm just looking at the clock, 25 minutes, which is sort of roughly what I was thinking. So hopefully you now have lots of questions, or at least some questions, and I will do my utmost to try and answer them.
Thank you, Henry. Well, at the moment we have no questions, so I wonder who's going to get in there first.
We've got a comment. There's a comment, or whose
I
comment is
think
that?
that was mine.
Oh, that's yours. Okay, so we've got no questions. We've got 54 participants without any questions. And maybe, if people do have comments or as well, I suppose they could go in either the Q&A or the comment box. And I will seek to.
Lovely. We've got one from Sarah here, actually. She says, how does your described approach differ from voluntary biocredits?
Right. Now, voluntary biocredits, I think what you're talking about is where a company is seeking to demonstrate that they are maybe nature positive or something like that, and there's a voluntary market that relates to some sort of projects, which could be anywhere in the world, that claim to have created some biocredits, biodiversity credits, and they're on some sort of voluntary market. Now, that is actually very different because you're relying on something that's being done anywhere in the world. You may not have that much information about it, exactly the basis. There's a lot of judgment in these. You haven't, like in the UK with BNG, got a standardized form of measurement, and there's no regulatory framework. So this is very, very different because actually these are projects on the ground in the UK that I'm talking about, that are part of, with BNG, part of a regulatory system, and actually on the wider system, partners such as water companies, the Environment Agency, obviously there's a regulatory system there as well in terms of services such as flood risk management. I mean, they have to ascertain that they're actually going to be delivered, and water companies will ensure that drought risk reduction as well is being delivered and so forth. So I'd say they are, if there was two ends of a scale, I'd say voluntary biodiversity credits are at one end, and this is somewhere at the other end in terms of its regulatory structure, reliability, etc., etc. Kathy, thanks for your question. Do you have any worked examples yet? Part of the reason I'm doing this is to try and find people to work with to get worked examples. We're sort of working off that the original usage of this sort of model was actually in digital network management. It's in Blackpool and Manchester and Brighton, and maybe somewhere else as well, but where you have a similar sort of problem where you've got different people owning bits of digital networks and a range of people who want to use the total network, and they've used a cooperative model to bring all those different parties together so they can strategically develop the network and agree on who pays what to access it and so on. So that's the really operating model. Interestingly, Kathy, I'm told that at the moment, almost none of the landscape recovery projects have worked out governance. So it's interesting. that at the moment solving this governance problem is not something that's been cracked yet. So we're hoping people might try these, because it's a difficult thing, and people often leave the problem of governance right to the end when they've sorted everything else out, and it's something that people aren't so comfortable with. On the cooperative model, again, anything in practice. As I said, the digital network management is where it is this sort of cooperative. These are called multi-stakeholder co-ops. So if you imagine the co-op supermarket is a consumer co-op, and there are worker co-ops people might be aware of. I can't think of any at the moment, but they're where the workers are part of the co-op. And there is actually at the moment an environmental farmers group co-op, and this is expanding across the country. It's in various different places, but that is actually a bit like a workers' co-op. It is a co-op just of farmers working together to effectively sell credits, biodiversity, nature credits, carbon credits, and so on. So they interact with markets. And so that's something else, that's a different type of co-op, but that has been quite popular. And on the face of it, it's easier sort of co-op to set up because it's all farmers and they know each other and they already have relationships. Whereas a multi-stakeholder co-op, you've actually got to develop relationships with a whole range of players who probably won't know each other and may even start by distrusting each other. So building that common purpose, building those relationships is absolutely essential to do, and takes time. This is not a, this is not a sort of immediate thing you can just implement straight away. How might you advise our landholders to get started on a local governance approach? Well, I think the first thing a landholder needs to do is develop a relationship. Now, they may already be in a farmer cluster, which is a pretty good starting point, because obviously they've started conversations about improving the environment on their land, etc., etc. So the next stage, obviously, is, well, how they get funding, what's the possible project, and I mean, a lot have obviously applied for landscape recovery projects, and that then provides you with resources to actually create the governance, as well as the overall, work out the overall projects you're going to be in. So that is a sort of pretty good route. Lens, obviously, working with Three Keel is another route. The challenge is finding funding for the work that needs to be done. NERF provided some of those funds as well, but the starting point from a landholder's viewpoint is, I think, a farming cluster, and developing that, starting to develop relationships and working out, well, what do you want to really do? Where do you see this market develop, especially with the current negative developments of the Net Zero Banking Alliance? Secondly, in cooperative models, do you expect to see rather national or international players, especially in cooperative models and on the buyer side, but also on the seller side? The local governance is not a well, it's interesting because Three Keel talk about landscape enterprise networks as being a sort of market, but it's more like developing long-term economic relationships, which is slightly different. Obviously, they're typical. A lot of businesses develop long-term economic relationships. They develop joint ventures with people. If you like, this is more like a multi-venture. Maybe that's a way of sort of seeing it, equivalent to something that's just in the private sector. So, I mean, a market, people think of, buying and selling and trading and lots of sort of transactions happening. So this is less transactional and more relational. But, that's, a lot of markets have a lot of relationships in them, as I'm sure people are aware. It's just that economists often see market in a very sort of particular way, of lots of trading, which is just only one part of economic relationships. The current negative developments of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Well, actually, if you take Lens, for instance, they don't rely on investors at all or markets. They're sort of self-funding in that the beneficiaries sort of pay in line with the needs of delivery. So that's quite different from situations where you get investment with a view down the track to have transactions to sell things. So the Net Zero Banking Alliance you do not need necessarily at all. And also, this is about local relationships, local action that can be replicated around the place, but not about trying to create some sort of grand international model. So it's not, it could be national players, but less likely to be international. Although there are people like, I think Pepsi and people who do operate, and obviously Nestle are working with Lens. So it doesn't exclude international players who want to build their supply chains, and ultimately with land management, all action is local. It depends, because you're trying to build relationships. There's a sort of question, you know, what do I know about these international players? Can I trust them? Are they going to stick around, etc.? So there's something, I think, to be said for developing relationships with businesses, organizations that are local, that you can have, it's easier to have an ongoing relationship side. On the seller side, it's got to be the local landowners, tenants, etc., who are delivering the benefits. Okay, Anna, this is getting good. I'm enjoying this. Lots of good questions. For projects that you want to combine payments, e.g. BNG and carbon, how do you get around additionality and stacking, or do you keep the parcels completely separate? In those cases, you are keeping the parcels separate, but you're putting them into a broader strategy. So you're because otherwise there's a bit of carbon sequestration happening there, a bit of BNG there, and there's no thought to how do they relate to each other? How can we make the most of their co-benefits so they're delivering more broadly? And how can we bring in other people who are interested in the co-benefits, which effectively they're getting for free, which will encourage them to come on board and build relationships and evidence bases for wider benefits. And also, by creating an organization, you're also creating a very transparent form of accounting. So everyone knows what the money, where the money's going, what it's delivering, and so on. So you can ensure that you are clearly meeting additionality requirements while also having a strategic approach, because there's nothing to stop a bit of land that's delivering BNG being next to a bit of land or the other side of a river that's delivering carbon sequestration. And that sort of collaboration and organisation of governments allows that strategic approach to deliver wider benefits. That's basically the trick. With a client made of many branches and standalone contracts, in this case the MOD, it feels like the co-op model might be a good fit. Huge landowner with a mixture of defunct facilities which could be demolished and a need to build new. Have I got the gist right? Well, yes. I mean, the MOD could be a member of a number of relevant co-ops for different bits of land that they're involved in, definitely. Actually, one of the first projects I worked on to try and sort of build this approach was in the river, the Hampshire Avon, and the MOD have tons of land there. And as well as, I think local authorities were interested as potential buyers as such, as well as Wessex Water. Actually, they used a contractual approach which didn't really work very well, because as far as I think things might improve, but at the time there was some suggestion that MOD felt a bit out of it and weren't getting as much out of it as they wanted. So the co-op, you know, when you're using contracts tends to sort of trying to do a deal more rather than trying to build common purpose and see what everyone's different interests and how they can work together, which is crucial. And I suppose with the MOD, I don't know how easy the MOD is to work with. Huge organizations can be difficult, but if they have good people who are able, you know, have the power to make decisions, they could be a good partner. Kathy, what evidence of nature recovery are investors asking for? Presumably they will be interested in the actual biodiversity return on their money. Well, I was thinking it's actually other things. I mean, biodiversity is, or I see as in this being covered by BNG with a clear way of measuring it, is actually the other benefits that don't have these standard metrics associated them with, which are more tricky. But by bringing in, I'm not talking about investors, by the way, investors, financiers, they're looking for a return on their investment. I'm talking about people who are actually benefiting, who want reduced drought risks, who want reduced flood risks, and each of them will have their own metrics, their own models for trying to work out what interventions are needed. So, for instance, the Environment Agency are doing at the moment some experiments in East Anglia looking at trying to bring a range of farmers together to do some interventions which they believe will increase the amount of rainwater. And remember, with climate change, rain is going to become more intense and so more likely to run off than actually recharge aquifers. So by actually creating indentations, places where water can gather, where the geology is such that the water can then get through, if you like, into aquifers below, you then get outcomes which is reduced environmental damage, maybe from droughts, reduced length of droughts, stuff like that. Now, the Environment Agency have modelled this, and they now want to test it out. So they will have ways of monitoring the impacts over time of different interventions. So they are testing whether they're getting the benefits that they would want to pay for. The trick is that you could have some interventions which are obviously doing multiple things. And so someone like the Environment Agency or ultimately water companies are getting reduced drought risk on the cheap because the costs of the landscape change and landscape management changes that are necessary are being part paid for from other people who are getting other benefits. So, you know, the combination of flood risk management, drought risk, reduced pollution, etc. So that's what you're trying to do. And by bringing people together to collaborate, you can see how what those synergies are, what you can deliver most easily, the landowners are happy about, the beneficiaries are all happy about, and create agreements very simply that can then, as you learn and change over time, can easily adapt. I mean, that's the trick. It's really about creating mechanisms for collaboration to create efficiencies out of synergies. So ultimately, people should be paying a lot less for what they're getting, whereas in standard markets, they're just transactions. You can't really find or see or do those synergies, and therefore you lose efficiency through synergies. How are we doing? 1:15.
Yeah.
Have we
Time.
run
time
out
for,
of
got time for a couple more questions if anyone's got any.
No open questions. Part of this, the point of this webinar was to see, you know, are people interested in this topic, and would people be interested in a more extensive course that could go more into the sort of underlying thinking, understanding more about environmental economics, ecological economics, etc. Cliff has come through. Cliff, is it helpful to recognise that the traditional contract-based approach is essentially based on competition for private gain, whereas the cooperative approach is about collaboration for the benefit of all? I think it is important to recognise that, Cliff. You obviously got that. So this is the key, you know, which I sort of said about creating common purpose and relationships around that common purpose. So people are all on the same page in terms of what you're trying to achieve, rather than people fighting over who can get the most for least, which is always sort of undermines relationships and leads to distrust and so on. You're trying to build trusting relationships and a trustworthy organization as well, that people looking outside believe that that collaboration is actually trying to deliver real public benefits rather than being some sort of get rich quick scheme, which seems slightly unlikely that will ever be the case in landscapes. But you can imagine people trying to tick boxes, trying to pretend, using things to try and tell stories about them being nature positive when they're not really at all. The classic, of course, is oil companies who tell big stories about the renewable bits they're doing, etc. And it turns out they're spending less on investing in renewables than the cost of the advertising campaigns that they pay for to tell people about what they're doing. And their investments are a tiny proportion of their overall investments, which of course are largely in fossil fuel exploration and so on. So you want to be careful with these sort of ventures, that you don't have partners who are just using it as a way of greenwashing. I mean, that's what we're really, concerned about. And within markets, I'm not quite sure how you tell. I mean, obviously within BNG there is a regulatory framework, so it should be controlled, but you don't know, of course, what else the people are doing, which may or may not be damaging in a wider scheme of things. Whereas if you're developing relationships, you can do your due diligence on your partners. You can be part of maybe a network of people who understand what these different companies are doing, working with investor organizations or looking at ESG compliance, etc., etc. So you have a bit more of a chance of working with people who are on the same page, trying to deliver the same outcomes, rather than just being a cover for people who are part of the destruction of our planet.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
Perfect.
if you are interested, I think there'll be a follow-up questionnaire, and people can respond. I'd be interested, in whether people want to go into this more deeply, understand how these different systems work, understand what the sort of background thinking from an economics viewpoint, etc., is, and increase your skills and capacity. That would be great. If you have a particular project you'd also like to talk to me about, or an opportunity you think where a cooperative governance structure could work, that would be great too. Cliff and I have also written a report that has a lot more sort of explanation on cooperatives and the sort of basically why they're much better than contracts. Right. Another question. Building collaborative partnerships will take time, as you mentioned. Would you advise on trialing BNG projects, etc., at the same time, building a broader strategy, or wait and build a partnership first? I think maybe both and. I mean, I think BNG projects take time as well. But it may be a good idea to start getting people, especially fellow landowners, on board at the same time, and then using the BNG project as a sort of demonstration. Also, maybe you don't want to totally sort your BNG project until you've talked to people like the Environment Agency, water companies, etc., to discuss, where might the BNG project go that delivers the most co-benefits, for instance. So I think the earlier you start on building dialogue, the better, really. And you've got something real like potential BNG projects as a sort of trial or something, something practical to discuss as well. So I think in that situation, you've got the best of both worlds. In terms of contacting me, I'm on LinkedIn. So do link up. Would there be some regulation to step in to well, some regulation if relationships turn sour? Well, actually, in developing your cooperative and co-designing it, you actually can put in the rules, for instance, to cover dispute resolution. So you can have ways of, at the beginning, I mean, it's a bit like a sort of prenup, I guess, that you build in a sort of rule of what you do if you fall out. Though, having said that, of course, if really relationships have broken down, then legal avenues don't tend to rebuild relationships. They might even end up in more and more disputes. So I think what you really need to do is build the relationships, do your due diligence to avoid ending up in the bed with the wrong person, and find ways of continuing those relationships. Actually, Kathy, I remember having a conversation with you some time ago about the work you were doing with farmers to build their capacity to catch insects and so forth and monitor them and work out where their biodiversity was and so on. And actually, one of the thoughts, I can't remember if I mentioned that to you, but one of the thoughts I had was that would be a really brilliant thing to do as a starter in terms of building relationships with a diverse set of people. Because actually, if you've got someone from a water company, someone from the environment agency, etc., all who were a bit unsure and didn't really know their beetle from their moth or whatever it is, you'd be able to put everyone on the same level. And because I think there can be a sort of cultural barrier between sort of farmers, etc., and the suits in civil service, etc., who are seen as different sorts of people, and they don't sort of meet so often, maybe. Yeah, you're just doing a report, good. But I think your work, Kathy, if I'm right, was with farmers. But I think if you could bring other people on and just bring them together all in rough clothes, so there's no sort of status differences, and use that as a way of building relationships to start with and getting people to realize that, it's just people, they're all people. The classic, there's more than unites us than divides us. And make sure you go to a pub afterwards. That sort of thing is, I think, a very good way, or could be, that's my suggestion anyway, a very good way of building initial relationships. And yeah, I'll look forward to your report, Kathy, as to how it's gone. I think it sounded very exciting work.
Brilliant. Okay. I think, Henry, it looks like we've naturally come to a close.
Well, that's great.
Um,
I've really enjoyed it. And thank you very much for all your questions, which seem very pertinent and to the point. And hopefully something, further conversations can come out of this.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your time today. And we'll get some further information out to everybody who's been listening today. Thank you very
Brilliant.
much. Take care.
Okay. Goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone.
then.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye.
Cheers then.